Hi, everybody. Happy Friday afternoon. It's another live edition of The Green Rush on Pro Cannabis Media. I'm Jimmy Young from Pro Cannabis Media, and who am I joined by as my co-host today?
David Rabinovitz. I'm glad to be here once again, Jimmy.
And we're also so happy it is the third Friday of the month, and that means we welcome in Morgan Fox, who is the Communications Director of the NCIA, one of the lead lobbyist groups in Washington, D.C. Morgan, how are you, and how is Washington, D.C.? Did you guys get snow down there?
I guess you could call it that. We got a couple of inches and everything shut down as usual.
That's typical of Washington, D.C. I know that. Meanwhile, I think it's been snowing 36 hours in the Massachusetts, Boston area right now, and people are just going about their thing. It isn't that big a deal. It's one of those snowstorms, but we obviously want to drive safe out there. Today's program is going to be focused on the economics of cultivation, and we do have a great lineup for everybody. But since Morgan is with us, and it's been a very interesting week down in Washington, D.C., for not just the NCIA, but for a whole bunch of other lobbyist groups out there, like the Minority Cannabis Business Association, like NORML. All of you guys got together, wrote a letter to President Joe Biden asking for the expungement of all cannabis possession criminals. How did all that come about?
Well, really, Justin Streekel at NORML took the lead on that and had been putting something like that together for a couple of months. And it was finally able to culminate in that letter, which was not only signed by a number of advocacy and industry groups, but also by 37 members of Congress, urging President Biden to basically pardon all nonviolent federal cannabis offenders and commute the sentences of anybody that was still incarcerated for such convictions.
And this actually, an executive order pardoning a group of people is not unique. I believe it was done for during the Vietnam War too, for people who opted out as conscientious objectors, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you weren't alive then. I was, and David was, but that I'm pretty sure that's not the first time it happened.
I think it was really only like 3 years before I was born, but yes, President Carter did pardon all people who avoided the draft. I believe Gerald Ford did something relatively similar as well, sort of related to the Selective Service program. And I think that it's also been done in antiquity too. Perhaps I think it was directly after the Civil War. Everybody that was a member of the Confederacy received a pardon. Not exactly the best comparison, considering we're trying to do the exact opposite of what those guys were fighting for. But it's not unheard of, and it's one thing that the Biden administration could do to live up to its stated promise of real criminal justice reform, particularly in the area of drug policy.
Absolutely. David, you got something for him?
Oh no, Jimmy. In this part of it, I prefer to listen.
All right, fair enough. That's cool. Morgan, you were actually well, let's go back to the last section about the Civil War, because it's an interesting comparison to what is going on in America today. Unfortunately, it does seem like some people are actually clinging to that division in this country for whatever reasons. And I think it's been established that the persons of color tend to get arrested a lot more than those who use cannabis as white people, so that the actual cannabis issue has become aligned with the race issue. Is that how lobbyists portray this when they go and sit and talk with members of Congress?
It's an issue that our team consistently brings up with every meeting that we have. The prohibition of cannabis began as a way to oppress racial minorities, and the restarting of it in the 70s with the Controlled Substances Act was just another step in that direction. And in the last couple of years, tapes have come out showing that Richard Nixon specifically employed prohibition policies in order to criminalize racial minorities and people that he disagreed with politically, namely the anti-war contingent that was growing in power at the time. So it's impossible to extricate issues of racial justice from prohibition and from cannabis policy. And this is definitely a step in the right direction that the administration could take. There are some other things that the administration could do unilaterally through executive action that would help us move further in the right direction while Congress is working on comprehensive cannabis policy reform that has robust restorative justice provisions in it. One of those things would be reinstating the Cole memo. Another would be directing the VA to allow their doctors to be able to recommend medical cannabis in states where it's legal. And I think a big one would be changing immigration policy so that cannabis would no longer be a trigger for deportation. It would no longer be a factor in citizenship approval, and it would no longer be a factor in traveling to the United States, because we've seen that cannabis arrests are consistently in the top 5 reasons that deportation proceedings are triggered. It's considered a mark of low moral character if you're applying for citizenship. And as we've seen over the last couple of years, people that are involved in the legal cannabis industry in places like Canada, Israel, and throughout the EU and throughout Latin America have been banned permanently from traveling to the United States if it's discovered that they're traveling here for the purposes of legal cannabis industry work.
That's crazy. And here's another stat that I heard over the last 24 to 48 hours. And David, you have your ears and your eyes on the state of New Jersey. I heard from someone from New Jersey yesterday, while the governor continues, I don't think, I've been checking the wires, as they used to say back in the day, and nothing has come across as far as New Jersey's governor writing and signing the bill into law. But even since November, since New Jersey voters voted for legalization of cannabis, there have been 6,000 cannabis possession arrests that their own DA in the state says we're not going to prosecute them. I mean, I don't get it. I'm sorry, I just don't get it. I get very frustrated.
It's frankly mind-boggling, and that actually seems like the rate is a little bit higher than normal. On average, New Jersey arrests around 13,000 people for cannabis possession or consumption every year. And so, I mean, if you're just looking at the math month by month, that's actually an increase in the number of arrests. So I'm not sure whether that is that law enforcement is being overzealous and trying to arrest as many people as possible while they still can, or whether people are confused about the fact that it's not quite legal yet and are being a little bit more brazen.
David, you might know the answer to this question. Do law enforcement officers have like car salesmen, they have a quota to make every month? Do they have to make a certain amount? Do you know if they have to make a certain amount of arrests every month? David?
Well, I know that a lot
go ahead, Morgan. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
A lot of them do have quotas, and some departments are based on specific types of arrests, and some of them are just a raw arrest number, regardless of the charge. But that's not really as much of an issue as the financial incentives that law enforcement has for continuing to keep cannabis illegal, primarily in the form of asset forfeiture and things like burn grants that are basically federal grant money that's available to local police departments that is based entirely on both the number and raw amount of drug seizures.
Right. Yeah, the federal government has a lot of influence in those areas through community-based programs. I have a cousin who was a prosecutor and would put programs together in East Boston many years ago because they were getting federal money if they got the right program submitted.
Yeah, and this sort of thing exists everywhere, and it's one of the reasons that law enforcement associations typically are the biggest opponents of legalization initiatives and legislation in every single state.
And yet I think the tide is turning. And while they may be a group, and in general that may be true, I've heard some very articulate cases by law enforcement now that it has become legalized. I'm remembering, David, you remember this. Remember the cop in Maine? I think it was the Bangor, Maine Police Department was posting on Facebook or something, and it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek post.
Oh yeah, that was yes. I do remember that.
I knew you'd remember that. And I'm glad that I can't remember the details, but I remember it happened.
Jimmy, before we move on, Morgan, what do you think the odds are that that you're going to be successful in trying to move the Biden administration to do something quickly?
Well, I don't know about quickly, but things are definitely moving in the right direction. The appointees that we've seen to major federal agencies have so far been at least not negative or problematic in terms of cannabis policy. Some of them are kind of gray areas, but overall, we've seen nothing that is really raising any sort of alarm bells or anything like that. In terms of getting immediate action, clearly the administration has a lot of issues on its plate right now, and cannabis policy might not be the number one issue for the administration, but because this is so heavily related to criminal justice reform that the president has been touting throughout his campaign, I think that it's very likely that it's at least going to get some consideration in the near future. I'm sure that there are people talking about it right now based on that letter. And whether or not we see immediate action, I think remains to be seen. But I think that at the very least, it's elevating the conversation within the administration, and certainly Congress is doing its part with that, both with signing on to this letter and prioritizing comprehensive cannabis policy reform in the Senate and in a lot of the appointment hearings that have been going on. Particularly, Senator Booker has been just a rock star in bringing this issue and the racial and social justice aspects of fighting prohibition front and center in every single opportunity that he has.
Yep. Have you followed kind of totally unrelated, but it ties in a little bit? Have you followed the issue that's going on in DC about the student loan forgiveness?
Not particularly. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren would like to see the government forgive the first $50,000 of student debt for everybody across the board. The Biden administration, as I understand it, came back and said, well, that's too much money and we don't want to do it across the board. We're not forgiving debt for people who went to Harvard and Yale. Kind of makes sense, right? People who go to Harvard and Yale hopefully can afford to pay their debt back. But what I found was interesting, this past week, there was a story that Biden had reached out to the Justice Department to ask them about the legality of actually forgiving $50,000 a person. And how I see that ties into marijuana is Biden was adamant, we're not doing that. And within 2 weeks, there's a story that he's already asking about, could we do it or how could we do it? And I'm looking at that as a promise that while he was not really that, he was the worst candidate on the Democratic side for marijuana reform, at least from what I saw. I think he could soften up very quickly on that.
Well, I think that that's absolutely true. And the president has shown that he is able to evolve and be flexible on this issue. And the more people that he talks to within his own administration, as well as in Congress, I think the better he's going to get across the board when it comes to cannabis. There's actually another interesting tie-in with the student loan issue that I really just thought of, that in a lot of states, if you are, and actually it used to be a federal rule up until just a short number of years ago, that if you were arrested for cannabis, you were ineligible for federal student aid. And that meant that you were forced to take out private student loans. I'm actually a perfect example of that. My high school cannabis arrest invalidated me for federal student aid, and I had to take out tens of thousands of dollars in private student loans in order to pay for college that have been hanging over my head for decades now. And that is something that I think really ties directly into cannabis, that people who have been arrested for cannabis, even if you don't go to jail, there are so many collateral consequences. And up until a few years ago, the inability to access federal student aid was one of them. And that basically put, tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people over the years into massive amounts of debt, most of the time for getting caught with a joint.
Thank you for sharing that personal note about your background, Morgan. I'll admit, I did not know that. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a suburb of Cleveland.
Okay. Wow. And that obviously has been with you for quite a while, and it would be nice if the president would expunge that for you, right?
Well, I mean, my charges wouldn't get expunged because they were based on state law, and that's where the vast majority of cannabis arrests take place. So really, there are a very, very small number of actual federal cannabis convictions, but at the very least, it would help those individuals, and it would also send a clear message to Congress and to the American people that the Biden administration is serious about criminal justice reform and, in particular, cannabis policy reform.
Yeah. It's actually what when we talked to Michael Correa, your lead lobbyist last week, he talked about how it's going to be a social justice reform driven bill that moves the cannabis cause forward, which I thought, by the way, great interview with Michael. The guy knows how to talk, doesn't he?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why he's the guy that talks to Congress.
Yeah, I think it's great. I really have enjoyed getting to know him, and I appreciate as much time as you've been able to give us too. Yeah, you were quoted recently in an article by Leafly that David Downs wrote about the vape testing failures at some state levels that already have legal state programs for adult use cannabis. We all remember the vape crisis. It was exposed by Leafly that it was a vitamin E acetate and it was more on the illegal market than the legal market. Would you like to see better testing in legal states? And again, you're a federal guy. I know it's a state federal thing, but the question of making sure that the products that are in the legal medical dispensaries are tested and not just for what's in the cartridge, but for emissions tests so that when you exhale, it's what's coming out of your lungs that is tested. And that's what Europe uses. And I believe other countries look at that as well. Is that something you'd like to see as part of this national reform?
Well, the emissions testing is actually testing what goes into your lungs as opposed to what comes out of it. But minor detail.
That's a pretty big detail, and I apologize for that. I thought that they were testing the emissions, what was being exhaled. Interesting.
It's what the cartridge emits, not what your lungs emit.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. But
okay.
So I mean, it's just a technicality, but the idea is there, and that's what we have been promoting since we released a vape safety paper right around the time that the E-Valley outbreak was occurring. That's what industry experts and a lot of the people on NCIA's committees are really promoting right now, and what some companies are actually doing on their own, even though the fact their individual states don't require it. Colorado is actually going to be the first state to require it. And I mean, I just want to preface this by saying that the states have been doing an excellent job at keeping unsafe products out of the consumer market. But there's no reason why they should not be using emissions testing when the industry and scientific experts are all saying the same thing, that emissions testing is the best way to not only determine if there are any unhealthy or potentially dangerous compounds in the cannabinoid mixture or concentrates themselves, but also within the actual devices that they're being that are being filled with these concentrates. And some of these products do emit heavy metals and can create byproducts that are very dangerous to people. So emissions testing is just the simplest and most effective way to determine whether or not a product is safe for consumers. And that also helps people in the business, because if they know that the people that are manufacturing their empty vape cartridges are using shoddy techniques or using dangerous heavy metals, they can switch suppliers. There's absolutely no reason for states not to start instituting this, and they simply haven't, despite the fact that they've been had a really good track record. There's also a problem that a lot of labs aren't prepared to be able to do that sort of testing. But despite the fact that NCIA mostly works at the federal level, we want states to be doing this, because right now there's no federal regulation. And until we pass a comprehensive cannabis policy reform bill for descheduling that includes a robust regulatory structure, and then the organizations and agencies that are in charge of that regulatory structure actually lay out what the regulations will be, it's incumbent upon the states to make sure that consumers and businesses are protected.
Absolutely. And I'm going to give Leafly another plug here. They had their annual jobs report in the cannabis industry, and I'm pretty sure that I think the number was 321,000 employed inside the cannabis industry, which is now more than electrical engineers, EMTs, and for some reason they threw dentists in there. But how rewarding is that for you as someone who's actually seen this industry grow from a few thousand employees to hundreds of thousands?
I mean, it's honestly mind-blowing, and I think it should send a strong signal to members of Congress as well as to state governments that this is an industry that could contribute a lot to the economic recovery post-pandemic, as well as creating a robust employment and economic sector in perpetuity. It's just absolutely wonderful to see how many people are benefiting from this in just such a short period of time that we've actually been seeing real reforms at the state level. I think it's important to point out that one of the things that was noticed in that was that because each state has its own basically siloed market, that a lot of these jobs are unnecessarily duplicative. So there might not be the necessity for that many roles with each individual company. However, when you finally change federal law and more states start to get on board, even if some companies are able to operate with fewer staff, the fact that there will be so many more markets and so many more businesses opening up after federal legalization means that we're not going to see any contraction of that number. It's only going to grow.
Fantastic. Morgan Fox, what a pleasure. It was so great to talk with you again. Thank you again. I'm going to look forward to the third Friday in March now. Is that cool?
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
You bet. That's
Good to see
Morgan
you again,
Fox,
Morgan.
the communication director of the NCIA, on our Green Rush live show here on Fridays. And it's Friday, and it's closing in on 4:20. In fact, I'm sure a few of your clocks have already passed that 4:20 mark. So I definitely want to take a little break. Let's set up the fact that the Waldos from the San Rafael, California area are the ones that actually got this 4:20 thing going. And law enforcement used to use that call to explain public consumption of cannabis going on. And my version of 4:20, which does coincide with 1971 when the Waldos started this whole thing, was a song by Jonathan Edwards called Shanty. And for every Friday at 4:20, we salute the whole community of the cannabis industry, the whole cannabis culture, if you will. Sit back, enjoy Jonathan Edwards singing Shanty, and we'll be back with more of our economics of cultivation on the Green Rush after this.